Hey, this is Ed from Foundry, and in this video, I'd like to demonstrate the differences between the two subdivision types in Modo. So I have a scene here with two mesh items, box A and box B, and I'm going to select box A, which is the yellowish box, and I'll press Tab. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice that the polygons type is subdiv. So that is the legacy subdivision mode in Modo. If I select the box B and press Shift Tab, you'll notice it subdivides a little bit differently. And in the bottom right hand corner, we see polygons Catmull-Clark. So the Catmull-Clark method of subdividing our surfaces is the newer method, and there are some advantages to using it, which I will cover. Before we go a little bit deeper, I just want to press O on my keyboard while hovering in the 3D viewport. And in the Active Meshes tab here, I'm going to enable Show Cages so that we can see what the meshes look like kind of before they are subdivided. So these green wireframes represent the unsubdivided meshes. So if I select both of them and press Tab, we can see that they are indeed still cubes. So I'll select box A, and once again I will just press Tab to go into standard subdivision mode. And if I select the top edges, so these four edges, and then come over to Vertex Map, Weight Tool, which you can also get to by pressing Shift W, that brings up our Vertex Map Weight Tool, and I begin to left click and drag in the viewport. You'll notice that when we reach 100%, the edges kind of collide with the top of the surface limit, or the top of the box. And if I actually select these edges around the cube and then press Shift W to go back to the weight tool and give those a weight of 100%, you can see that the top of this cube was spherical, but now it's actually reaching the limits of the cube. So again, I'll press Shift W and I'll bring that weight down to 0. And of course, you can go below 0% to kind of invert the weight effect if you pull the weight into a negative number. But we'll just set that back to 0. And of course, with all of these edges selected, if I increase the weight to 100, even though we're in a subdivision mode, the cube in subdivision mode still represents a cube. It doesn't kind of average out the surfaces and become more spherical. So a difference between the two subdivision methods is really apparent when you try to weight a vertex. So if I select this vertex and press Shift W to bring back the weight tool, and I left click and drag to increase the weight, you can see in the value box the weight is increasing, but nothing is happening on the surface, or nothing is happening on the actual mesh. So I'll just press return that to 0, and then I'll press Tab to get out of subdivision mode. Now I'll select our box B, and I'll press Shift Tab, which will put us into Catmull-Clark mode, and let's go over some of the differences here. So if I press 2 to go into Edges mode and select these top edges, and then press Shift W to bring back our weight tool, and then left click and drag, you'll notice that a weight of 20% brings us to the top of the box. Whereas with our other mesh, if I press Tab to go into standard subdivision mode, not Catmull-Clark subdivision mode, and I select these top edges and press Shift W, we actually have to go to 100%. So that's a key difference. And let me explain why 20% weighting is all you need to reach the maximum creasing or maximum hardness of this weighting. So once again, I'll press Shift W and I'll bring this down to 20%. So anything below 20% will start to smooth out and return the form to its spherical shape. And with Catmull-Clark surfaces, unlike standard subdivision surfaces, if you go to a negative number, it won't kind of invert or pull in on itself. So okay, we have a weight of 20%. Let's, with the box B, the red box selected, let's actually come over to the Surface tab in the Properties, and let's have a look at the subdivision level. So at the moment, our subdivision level is 2. If I were to increase that to 3, you'll notice that it smooths out a little bit. And in order to reach maximum creasing or maximum hardness, I have to increase the weight to 30%. So there's a direct correlation between the weight percentage and the subdivision level. So for example, if I were to increase the subdivision level to 5, you'll see there is a little bit of a softening happening here on these edges, and I would have to increase the weight to 50%. So you need 10% weight for each subdivision level. So a subdivision level of 1 would only need 10%, subdivision level of 2 would need 20%, and so on. Now, if I return the weight to 0, and then I leave the subdivision level at 5, and then I select this vertex and press Shift W to bring back the weight tool, and I left click and drag, you'll notice this is a big difference between Catmull-Clark subdivision surfaces and standard subdivision surfaces. So if I increase this to 50%, this vertex, it will actually return to where the vertex was on the cube. So Catmull-Clark surfaces allow you to use vertex weighting, which is pretty interesting. So let me just undo that. And I'll return the subdivision level to a level of 2. And let's talk about how subdivision surfaces work with MeshFusion, because now MeshFusion can actually use Catmull-Clark subdivision surfaces for fusing. So I'm going to select this box A, and I'll press Shift Tab twice to put that into Catmull-Clark subdivision mode. So now both of these are subdivision surfaces. And actually, before I go into the MeshFusion part, let me do two things. One, I'll press O on my keyboard, and with active meshes, I'm just going to disable Show Cages. And then I just want to explain how these are being stored, how the vertex maps are being stored. So if I change my default viewport to vertex map, you'll notice that both of our meshes have turned this kind of grayish green color. If I come over to the Lists tab under Weight Maps, and I click on Subdivision, you can see there's a color coding going on here, and the red color means that there is weights. So this is for box A. On box B, if I have subdivision weight map selected, it's still gray-green because we don't have any weight map. So if I once again press Shift W and increase the weight to 20, you'll see that it begins to turn a little bit red. And similarly, if I come over to the properties, change the subdivision level to 5, and then increase the weight to 50%, or anything above 50%, we get this nice red color. And one other thing that's really nice about this, if I switch this back to default mode, and then I select this edge, and then press Shift W and decrease the weight slightly, less than 50, we have this nice hard edge to soft edge transition, which is pretty cool. And that's all caused by weighting. And what's nice about this is it works with fall-offs. So you can really create some really nice weighting effects with fall-offs. So once again, Shift W, let me return the subdivision level to 2, and then I'll change the weighting to about 20 to keep these hard. And maybe I'll actually also weight this as well. So Shift W, keep that at about 20, just to make a little bit more of an interesting shape. And now remember, if I press Shift Tab, this is still just a cube. So it's really neat, the types of shapes that you can make with this. Okay, so now box A is also a Catmull-Clark subdivision surface, and similarly, I'll grab these edges and Shift W just to make another shape. And then let me just make this a little bit more interesting, just so we have something to work with when we're using MeshFusion. And this is just going to be a quick demonstration. So I'll select this box A in items mode, and I'll press Control F to bring up my pie menu for MeshFusion, and I'll choose New Fusion with Selected. That sets this box A as the primary in our new Fusion setup. And you'll notice that the Fusion item, which is procedural, is actually not respecting the edge weights. So in order to get that to respect the edge weighting, I'm just going to select the Fusion item, and then I'll come down to Fusion Mesh, this section, and I'm going to do two things. One, I will change the edge weights to on, so I'll enable that. And now you can see there are some edge weighting starting to happen. I'm also going to change the mesh mode from draft to airtight final with parts, just because this is such a simple setup, I'll just go straight to airtight final. I'm also going to enable deferred updates. Okay, so I'm going to select these edges that we had hardened, and I'm doing this because you'll notice that it's a little bit soft right here. It's not really working similarly to how we had it with standard Catmull-Clark surfaces, where a weighting of 20% makes this completely creased or reaches maximum hardness. So I'm going to press Shift W again, and this is just to demonstrate that with MeshFusion, the weighting is handled a little bit differently. It kind of goes back to a 0 to 100 scale. So if I'm at 20% now, if I click and drag, you can see that we get a slightly more creased effect. So I'm actually going to put that up to about 45%. That gives us some nice creasing there. And then I'm going to select this mesh item, box B, and I'll just move it in, well, let's say polygons mode, so that there's some overlap between the two meshes, like so. Maybe I'll scale this up a little bit in Z and Y. And then I'll press 5 to go into items mode. I'll select box B, left click and drag it onto box A. And when I get this menu, I'll choose Fusion, Apply Subtraction. And now you can see we're getting some nice effects here. But we're getting this kind of rounded corner here, and that's because even though these edges are weighted, I have to weight them a little bit more than 20%. So I could bring it up to 45%. So if I click in the viewport with my weight tool set to 45%, you can see that we get a little bit more of a creased corner. And let me actually bring that up to 60%, so that it's nice and sharp. And then I'm actually going to move this down. Whoops, not both of those, just this box B, so we can kind of see what we're getting here. And I will Control 1 to toggle wireframe or toggle the grid. And what's amazing about this is just the first steps towards a more complicated shape. But remember, these are just two cubes, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. If I hide the Fusion item and then press Shift Tab to get out of Catmull-Clark mode, you can see the two cubes that we're working with. The six-faced subtractive element, and then the six-faced primary or positive element. So edge weighting is really powerful. It's a really good way to make super complex shapes with MeshFusion. So I hope that's been helpful. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask in the comments. Definitely click subscribe and join our Foundry forum. Thanks for watching.